We're live. Hi everyone, this is Dr. Victoria Nalule, and in today's webinar we shall be addressing issues concerning negotiating petroleum agreements with a focus on stabilization clauses. So here with me, we shall be joined by Professor Peter Cameron, who is the Director at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral and Policy. We also have Dr. Carole Nakhle, who is the CEO of the Crystal Energy, and was supposed to be joined by Mr. Peter Mulisa from the Uganda National Oil Company, but he'll not be able to make it due to the political situation in the country. So before we start, I would like our speakers to briefly introduce themselves, because I'm not going to read out their bios, but they can introduce themselves for a few minutes. And then I'll start off with the discussion with my presentation. And then afterwards, Professor Cameron will also come in with his remarks, and Dr. Carole Nakhle will also make her presentation, and we shall have the Q&A. But feel free to send in your questions in the Q&A if you have any questions. Dr. Carole Nakhle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you all for joining us. I'm becoming a regular of the webinars organized by Dr. Nalule, and it's a great pleasure also to join again Professor Peter for this webinar. I'm an energy economist by training, background, and I'm at the same time the CEO of Crystal Energy, and we specialize in energy economic analysis and policy. And one of the areas that keeps us very busy is actually negotiating oil and gas contracts from the economics perspective, and how we can achieve a mutually beneficial outcome for the host government and the investors. I'm originally from Lebanon, but I've traveled extensively around the world, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And I cannot wait for the crisis, the COVID crisis, a nightmare to be over, to go back to the continent.
All right, thank you very much, Carole, for the introduction. Professor Peter Cameron, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everybody. Great pleasure to be talking to you, and to be working with Victoria again on one of the webinars, the many webinars that she's organized for the Extractives Hub project. And that's a project that we're doing within the framework of the University of Dundee's Centre for Energy, Petroleum and Mineral Law and Policy. I'm the director of that centre, and I think many of you will have heard of the centre. The centre is a multidisciplinary unit, and we have law, we have economics, and we have political science, and we all interact with each other, and we have this remarkable group of students that join us, a different group every year from many different parts of the world. My background is in law. I do a certain amount of practice as a lawyer, but mainly as an arbitrator, where I'm sitting with ICSID at the moment. But I do a certain amount of writing as well, as you have to do if you're in the university world. And the area that I've focused on is international energy investment law. And that has also involved, as Victoria knows, looking at stabilization clauses and various other forms of legal stability in the energy sector. And if I can be forgiven a plug, the new edition of my book on this will be coming out in the second half of this year with Oxford University Press. I'm rather pleased that's gone to the publisher. And by the way, I'm a Scotsman, so you may not recognize that from the accent. I'm sorry, we don't all have these really strong, rich accents. But I am the genuine article. So thank you very much. Look forward to the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Peter, for the introduction, and thank you very much, Carole, for introducing yourselves. So before we start, I would like to obviously put out some books. This is a book by Professor Peter Cameron that was talking about international energy investment law, the pursuit of stability. And it's a very important book for this webinar. And also Dr. Carole Nakhle's book on petroleum taxation, sharing the oil world. So you have a group of experts who are going to be talking to you. but obviously you cannot forget my book on energy transitions in Africa and other books. So get yourselves copies of these 3 books, and we shall start from there. So I'll start off the discussion with my presentation. I'm going to make a short presentation of around 7 minutes, and then thereafterwards, Professor Cameron will also come in with his presentation, and then Dr. Carole Nakhle will also present, and then we shall be responding to some questions. So to start, I will share my slides. Okay, so the theme today is about negotiating petroleum agreements, specifically stabilization clauses. And I'll be focusing on some of the key issues for international oil companies when they are negotiating, some of the key issues for the host governments, and also some issues with respect to stabilization clauses, especially how they relate or how they're being used in developing countries. So I didn't introduce myself, but Victoria Nalule. I'm a holder of a PhD from the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral and Policy. I also work with Professor Peter Cameron as a research fellow at the Extractive Hub, which is also based at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral and Policy at the University of Dundee. I'm an author of several books, but my research has mostly focused on African energy and mining sectors, including my first book on energy access and poverty challenges in sub-Saharan Africa, where I look at the role of regionalism. I'm also into mining, so I have a book on mining and the law in Africa, exploring the social and environmental impacts. I have my new book with the Hart Publishers in London, focused on land access and extractives in Africa, focusing on law and governance. And also the edited book I just showed you, which is on energy transitions and the future of the African energy sector. So besides writing, I'm involved in different initiatives of reviewing energy, mining, and petroleum laws and policies for different African countries, including for South Africa, Namibia. We're currently working with Rwanda, Uganda, and also through the Hub project, I'm involved in offering technical assistance to African governments and policymakers with respect to the management of oil, gas, and mining projects. So my presentation is going to be short because I have 2 experts whom you would really need to hear from. Professor Cameron supervised me from 2013 to 2018. So yes, he's my boss, and you definitely need to hear what he has to say on stabilization clauses. Dr. Carole Nakhle has done a lot of work with respect to the energy sector, the oil and gas sector. So my presentation will be brief so that we can get to hear from them. So the outline of my presentation, I'll start by looking at briefly petroleum investments, and also the key issues for host governments when they're negotiating petroleum agreements. And then I'll also highlight the key issues for the international oil companies. And then I'll briefly look at the stabilization clauses and also point out some of the other ways in which investors can protect themselves if they're not going to rely on stabilization clauses. So when we're talking about petroleum agreements, we have to understand that these are basically agreements concerning governing the relationship between governments and international oil companies, which are in most cases investors. Energy investments are very expensive ventures, which are mostly beyond the reach of national oil companies or even governments themselves. So for this reason, in most cases, host governments need to attract international oil companies who have the resources, including capital, the technical know-how to be able to exploit and also produce these resources. So that is where the relationship starts from, the relationship governing the host governments and also international oil companies. So basically, with oil discoveries, many people have expectations. The host communities expect to benefit. They expect to see developmental infrastructure. Governments expect to see increased revenue, and also for the international oil companies, they're expecting to get lots of profit from their investments. So meeting the expectations of all the stakeholders concerned requires good and effective negotiation skills. And whereas there are various key issues to consider with respect to petroleum agreements, my focus here is on where to start from when you're negotiating a petroleum agreement. So obviously, we cannot ignore issues of management and governance, including the need to ensure transparency and accountability. We have already seen the initiatives with the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, the national initiatives, regional initiatives, and also international initiatives to ensure good governance and management of energy resources. All those are very key, not only when negotiating, but also when managing the resources. So during negotiations, what questions do we need to ask ourselves? So the first thing is, who are the parties to these negotiations? And the main parties include definitely the host government and the international oil company. But with the rise for community engagement, with the rise on issues concerning social license to operate, corporate social responsibility, we also have to think about the local communities and the host communities, because obviously, besides negotiating petroleum agreements, other issues have to come into play, including land access. Where are these people going to be relocated? Issues concerning compensation, issues concerning the national contract laws, employment laws. So all those come into play when you're negotiating petroleum agreements. But the issues that are specific to the petroleum agreements themselves, that we really have to take into consideration. In most cases, we have to be concerned about the technical and legal issues in the contract, including stabilization clauses, the fiscal regime, that is like the taxation, royalties, what should the company pay, what should the host government ask for, accounting standards. Those are issues that really have to be considered when negotiating. However, issues that are often ignored are issues concerning health and environmental issues. In the past, these have been ignored, but in recent years, we're seeing many governments and international oil companies putting emphasis on health and environmental issues, especially with the recent 2015 Paris Agreement, where we are all concerned about climate change, we're all concerned about energy transitions. Then issues of environment play a big role. Like I mentioned, the social impact has to be taken into consideration. The communities who are going to be the host communities for these projects, they have to be taken into consideration because they also have their different expectations from the project. Now, the most important thing when negotiating for the host country is to decide on the contract structure. And here they have to ask themselves, are they going to go with a concession or a license agreement? Are they going to go with a production sharing agreement? Or is it going to be a joint venture or service agreement? So the contract structure is very important for the host government to decide what kind of agreement they want to have with the oil companies. Now, like I mentioned, many stakeholders have expectations when they discover oil and gas in their countries. So the question arises, how can the challenges of rising expectation, desires, and demands be satisfied? How can we meet the expectations for host governments, that is revenue sharing? They're more concerned about the revenue. Host communities, They want to see developments in their communities. They want to see development of infrastructure. And then for the oil companies, they're concerned about the political stability, the legal stability, and also ensuring that their investments are protected. So meeting all these expectations requires the parties to be able to negotiate the key terms of the agreement. We have seen in instances where the public is dissatisfied with the negotiations or dissatisfied with the projects, and we have seen political instability in countries such as Venezuela due to some of the expectations that were not met. So this makes negotiation very key in order to meet all the expectations and desires of the parties concerned. But also important to note that petroleum agreements are really complex because you have to think about the issue of the cost of exploration and development, the ever-changing market conditions. We know that the price of oil has not been stable. So governments, host governments and oil companies have to be concerned about these market conditions. And then also the difficulty of recovery, and then also not knowing the exact size of the field. All these make petroleum agreements complex agreements that require people who are really well equipped to be able to negotiate. And then the other important thing is the issue or the element of time, because with petroleum investments or energy investments, they're for a very long period of time, usually maybe 20 years or even 40 years. So within that time frame, will the political and legal situation be the same? So those are the key issues of concern that basically raises concerns, or that raise most oil companies to go for or ask for stabilization clauses. But before I discuss stabilization clauses, I will briefly point out the key concerns for host governments. Like I mentioned, energy investments are very expensive ventures. So they're more concerned about finding ways to attract international oil companies. And in attracting international oil companies, governments are, especially in developing countries or emerging nations, they're faced with the issue of conflict of interest, public interest versus private interest. At one side, on one point, on the other side, the governments want to protect the public interest by ensuring that they benefit from the resources. And then on the other side, they want to police the international oil companies to be able to attract them. So how do you strike that balance of protecting the public interest so that they can get the best from the resources and also to attract international oil companies? And another challenge for governments is the lack of the necessary technical experience or expertise, because they're dealing with companies that possess greater financial resources, that have superior knowledge of the oil fields, and they're more experienced with respect to negotiating contracts. For instance, you look at the net worth of Exxon. In 2019, it was $350 billion US dollars. And then in the same year, it earned an income of $14.3 billion. So these companies have the resources, the financial resources. And on the other hand, countries, host governments, especially in developing countries, don't have these resources. So that also presents a major concern for host governments, who are in most cases not forced, but they have to look for expertise elsewhere from developed countries. And then this also raises the issue of sometimes mistrust or even competing interests between the people who are negotiating for the government and maybe the companies they've worked with in the past. So those are some of the issues that really come up with respect to negotiating petroleum agreements. The other thing that governments have to be aware of is the issue of environment, social, economic, and political situation of the country, and also the new instances of where governments are asking for local content they want their people to benefit a lot. So how do you strike a balance of ensuring that the host government will not seem to be asking too much from the international oil companies with all these issues of local content, corporate social responsibility, social license to operate, and the most important thing being infrastructure development like refineries, because at the same time, whereas most developing countries don't have the resources to invest in the necessary infrastructure, they need to demand international oil companies to be involved in this infrastructure development so that the benefits can be seen from their countries. So these are the key concerns for the government. And then, like I mentioned, this is just a continuation. The challenge is the lack of sufficient domestic know-how or expertise, whether technical, financial, or legal, for development, implementation, and management. And then the solution has always been to hire outside negotiation experts, but then there are always issues of mistrust between the experts, outside experts, and the local authorities or local experts. And for the international oil companies, the key issue, like I mentioned, is the political stability for the country. Because in most cases, these companies are going to operate in maybe developing countries that are not politically stable. So they are concerned about the issues of governance. Is there laws against corruption? And then is the legal and regulatory framework stable enough to protect their investments? And then with issues of local content, which most governments are demanding for, they're concerned about the local expertise. Are they well equipped to really take up these projects if they are to fulfill the local content provisions? And then also, in most cases, oil companies are concerned about the costly and speculative exploration investments and the number of dry wells. So all these create risks. And in order to, my thing is stuck. And in order to address most of these risks, oil companies always ask or negotiate to have stabilization clauses in their petroleum agreements. So that is the basis for stabilization clauses. The concerns for international oil companies, which is mostly the political climate, the stability, to be assured that the legal and regulatory frameworks will be stable for the time frame or for the time when their investments are in place. And also to ensure that at the end of the day, because they are not charity organizations, they're interested in profits. So at the end of the day, they have to get their profits back. So with the stabilization clauses mainly aim to preclude the application of an agreement to any subsequent statutory or regulatory act issued by the government that modifies the legal situation of the investor. And these are basically based on the fact that in the past, most of the countries were politically unstable and most oil companies were victims of nationalization of oil and gas projects. So in order to protect themselves, they always ask for stabilization clauses. So basically the effect is not to preclude a state from enacting new legislation, but rather to prevent it from enforcing new regulations against the international oil company. And stabilization clauses can extend to any law that affects the economic conditions of the contract, but may also be limited as they relate to the sovereign's employment, environmental, or human rights law. So in summary, stabilization clauses are of a fiscal nature, that is those that concern taxation, royalties, and then there are also stabilization clauses of the legal nature that concern the issues of statutory framework and the laws that are likely to affect the oil and gas resources. So here I'll briefly go through the types of stabilization clauses. The phrasing clauses, which seek to stabilize the effect of a change in law by effectively phrasing the laws of the host state, which were enforced on the date that the contract came into effect. And then there are also economic equilibrium or economic stabilization clauses, which seek to re-establish the economic position of the contract following changes in law, which have an economic impact on the bargain struck between the host state and its contractual pattern. But with economic equilibrium or economic stabilization clauses, the host governments or oil companies have to agree on the trigger, on the triggering event that has to be agreed upon if these clauses are to work. And then there are also prohibitions on unilateral changes. These are also known as intangibility clauses, where the terms of the Petroleum Agreement may not be modified or abrogated except with contracting parties' mutual express consent. And then the other is the Allocation of Burden clauses, which seeks to allocate the fiscal and related burdens created by a unilateral change in the law. And these are in most cases, they're bared by national oil companies. So the question that most host governments ask in the global south is, are these clauses even legal? And are they fair? Because prima facie, you will notice that most oil-rich countries in the developed countries, they don't have stabilization clauses. And even those which have stabilization clauses, they are for a limited period of time, let's say for 5 years or 3 years, like in the case of Norway, when it had just discovered its oil and gas, they had a limited stabilization clause for 3 years. And then thereafterwards, the company was able to change or modify its tax regime. But what is the problem of stabilization clauses in developing countries? The problem is these clauses, they run for a very long period of time. If the project is for, let's say, 20 years, in most cases, oil companies will persuade the host governments to have a stabilization clause that is going to run for 20 years. And what is the impact of that? The impact is that the government will have to, with the stabilization clauses will require government to compensate an oil company for any change in the nation's laws, rules, or regulations that adversely affect a company or its operations. So they are not fair and they're not legal because they limit, the oil companies through stabilization clauses limit the normal prerogatives of any legislature and government, such as the right to enact and issue protective environmental, labor, and other regulatory laws. And in this respect, because we know with the Constitution, in most developing countries, the resources belong to the state, and then the country has a right to enact laws. And with the changing legal, regulatory, and also political environment and the social environment, the government should be in a position to change its laws to respond to these changes. So stabilization clauses that are in effect for a very long period of time, prima facie, they are not legal and they are not fair, because if compared to other developed countries, you see the same provisions are not applying. And then, like I mentioned, the issue of time frame is very key. So if a country, a host government is to negotiate stabilization clauses, they have to put into consideration the issue of time frame. They should not be bullied to negotiate stabilization clauses, which are going to be in effect for 20 years. It should be at least 5 years, and they should have the capacity and the ability to be able to amend their laws to respond to the changing social, economic, and political situation. This is the example I was talking about Norway and their model of stabilization clauses, where after 3 years, they were able to double the maximum royalty rate to 18% after 3 years of discovery, despite the clauses they had with respect to stabilizing the investments. So the question arises, what are the options for the investors in the absence of stabilization clauses? And the options for investors, obviously, with most national with most host governments, there are already national laws protecting investments. In the Constitution, most laws protect against, in the Constitution, most laws protect against nationalization, and then there are provisions for protection of investors and investments. But besides the national laws, there are also unilateral, bilateral investment agreements, treaties, BITs. There are also multilateral investment treaties like the Energy Charter Treaty. And then there are also region energy laws and protocols like the 2013 ECOWAS Energy Protocol. In SADC, they have an energy protocol. So all these laws, region and multilateral investment treaties should be able to provide investors with the protection they need. And in that respect, for country that is stable, that has been stable, politically stable for a very long time, whether it's developing or developed, they shouldn't really be put in a position where they have to offer stabilization clauses that are going to run for a very long time. They should be able to renegotiate and also offer protection to investors through other avenues like I mentioned, the BITs, the MITs, and also the local investment legislations. So that is my brief presentation. I'll let Professor Cameron speak. Maybe he's away. Carole, do you want to go next?
Yeah, or maybe he's on mute, or I'm happy to go ahead. Shall I?
Peter, are you there?
Yeah, I am here. Sorry, but why don't you go ahead, Carole? I had just a slight technical issue there, but I don't know if you can see. Yeah, you can see me there. Yeah, I'm quite happy if you go ahead. You have some slides which will make your presentation a little bit more interesting than mine. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. But first, I need Victoria's permission to share my screen. But, you know, Victoria covered a lot, so I'm going to look at the issue from the economist perspective. But let's see if I can now share it. Let me see if I hope I don't open anything embarrassing. Here we go. So I'm going to really take it from where Victoria left it, but probably I'm not going to be as comprehensive in my coverage, but try to frame the issue of stabilization provisions, looking at the broader perspective, but at the same time looking at one particular aspect of stabilization provisions, that is the fiscal stabilization in an oil and gas contract, which targets fiscal terms. So they would lock in the fiscal terms for a certain period of time, typically the duration of the contract, depending, of course, on the country in question. But first, before I go into the details, let me ask you, and just think about it, we cannot take the answers from all of you. If you were negotiating an oil and gas contract in 2019, or even before, in the last few years, would you have taken into consideration the events that happened last year and that are still with us this year, and God knows how long they are going to last? I think, I mean, if one of you says yes, I would have said you really, you can see the future, a fortune teller. But the point I'm trying to make here is that COVID-19, what happened with us and still with us today, taught us a very important lesson: to expect the unexpected. Now, why I say that? Because if you try to capture all the scenarios in an oil and gas contract, I mean, you're going to have a very, very, very long contract. And I don't know, you're going to need a very big team of negotiators. So we'll have to live with the fact that oil and gas projects are inherently risky. And of course, any kind of investment, but particularly oil and gas project, and I'm going to tell you why. But first of all, let's look at what has been happening last year, simply because that will make us think about how to move on, how to adapt the fiscal stabilization if we are going to use them in oil and gas contracts, and how governments, host governments, are likely to react to the situation. So first of all, remember that what we are dealing with is a crisis like no other, to quote the IMF, because we had the pandemic sending our global economy into coma, and that in turn affected the oil demand. And here you can see the massive decrease in economic growth. Just at the time before the pandemic, everybody was expecting a continuous economic growth, and look at the dip of around 5% decline or contraction in the global economy. And the scene can be quite dramatic, actually, if you look at specific economies. And the situation, although it's going to look better this year, hopefully, or in the coming years, but I feel that the pandemic has left us with scars that are going to have longer term effect. But look at oil prices. Again, I go back to my initial question. Who would have thought that oil prices, and here I'm talking about the WTI, the West Texas Intermediate in the USA, could go negative? And they did for the first time in the history of the industry. In April last year, WTI went negative. It reached almost minus $40 a barrel. No one would have ever expected this kind of reaction to the crisis. And where we are today, yes, situation has improved, but you can see we're still below the levels we started with at the beginning of the year. But let's not just, look at the last few months only. Let's take a longer term perspective. So this is, if you want, the last 10 years, a snapshot of oil prices over the last 10 years. And you can see that we started with an oil price in 2011, between 2011 and 2014 of $110 a barrel. And then we saw the collapse in 2014, a bit of recovery, but we never went back to the 2011, 2014 levels. And after that, with COVID-19, we went into even lower levels. So again, if you were negotiating contracts in 2010, 2011, and I bet you wouldn't have really captured these kind of scenarios of the 2014 and then even worse, the 2020. So there's a lot of uncertainty here. I'm talking about only one type of uncertainty and risk, and that is the commercial risk. Now, how are governments likely to respond to the situation that you are facing today? Earlier, last year, actually, my colleague Theo Atiompong and myself published a paper trying to do some coffee reading or tea leaf reading for some of you, whereby we try to identify how would government react to the current crisis, because it's a crisis like no other. So you would expect governments, host governments around the world, to take some action to safeguard and salvage the investments in their country, because everywhere around the world investments were slashed, and also government revenues were squeezed. And typically we found under such scenario, if you look at previous experience, governments tend to revisit their licensing, legislative, regulatory terms, as well as the contractual arrangements that they had previously agreed on with investors. And you can download the paper from the link below. I'm going to share my slide with you. So we should expect some reaction, and it's already started in some countries, but what that reaction is going to translate into, and is it going to be really sustainable? Victoria referred several times in her presentation to the concept of fairness, whether stabilizing the terms of the contracts is fair. And also she referred to the book by Professor Cameron about the pursuit of stability. But I think it's like pursuing the end of the rainbow, or chasing the end of the rainbow, because in oil and gas, we have inherent instability, not just the commercial risk I talked about, but you also have the geological risk, you have the political risk, you have the economic risk, a whole bunch of risk available. And the key, in my opinion, the key element that will make that instability inherent to oil and gas project is the lack of objective, universal definition of what is fair. What does a fair oil and gas contract look like? And when I zoom in on fiscal regime, I find the word fairness, or the synonymous of fair, appears quite often in government statements where they say, we want to get a fair value of the proceeds, we want to achieve a fair and equitable return, and it doesn't matter where you are, it's not just in developing countries, but equally in developed economies. But really, I ask, and this is a question I always ask whenever I'm doing some work on fiscal regime, advising governments, particularly on this aspect, I say, what is fair in your opinion? Is it 50-50? Is it 60-40, 70-30 to government investors? And if you ask, even within the same ministry, 5 different people, I bet you will get 5 different answers, let alone asking people from external institutions or investors or other countries. And not only that, what constitutes fair actually varies. And one of the factors that affect that definition is oil price and gas prices, of course. So for example, if you were in 2011-2014 period, you would have thought that maybe 60% government take versus 40 for the investor wasn't fair, and therefore governments tightened their terms and they went, I don't know, above that. In today's terms, maybe 80-20 to the government versus the investor may not be seen fair by investors. So you see, it's constantly changing. And I know that when we talk about, when we preach and we advocate for fiscal terms and contractual stability, we know that this is, in theory, one of the principles of an ideal fiscal regime. But we also acknowledge that you need to allow for a certain degree of flexibility in the contract, because you are dealing with something apart from share. So we're talking about the majority of oil and gas projects. They are for the very long term. So 30 years down the line is quite the norm for any oil and gas project. So you cannot really start, fix your contractual terms and fiscal terms and leave them cast in stone for the next 30 years, simply for the reason that you are unable to capture all the scenarios that will unfold in the coming years. That say, and this is sometimes people get upset because they think I'm advocating instability. No, you can use many ways to get around that. And this is just a slide to show you the complexity of an oil and gas project. And it's not just about production profile, it's everything that happens before the production, from the pre-licensing to the exploration phase, the development, production, EOR, decommissioning, etc. So it's a combination of very complex issue and involving not just the 2 stakeholders as government investors, but a much bigger number of stakeholders, including local communities. So people usually think that, okay, let's use stabilization provisions. And here I'm going to address the fiscal stabilization clauses, which is chosen in my area of expertise. And they address primarily all taxes and fees. And on this particular subject, a former colleague of mine from the IMF, Mario Mansour, and I wrote a paper which was published in 2016 on this particular subject. So you can look at the details and the type of stabilization provisions in this respect offered around the world. But one of the questions we addressed, and we did so by surveying both the literature and, of course, with the practice in many countries around the world, we found that, first of all, it is a feature of developing countries and not developed economies, though there you may find 1 or 2 exceptions, but really it's in the developing countries where you find these kind of provisions. And it is often implemented or adopted to compensate for the perception of higher political and regulatory risk. So you say, changing the fiscal terms will add an additional risk to an already long list of risks. So why don't we minimize that risk by having a fiscal stabilization clause in the contract? And this is particularly the case when you have a combination of, other risks, such as the higher geological risk. And also some governments would use it when they want to improve investors' confidence. They want to appeal to investors and reduce their risk premium. And also, and some people might think it is superior to tax exemptions and tax holidays, which actually translate into an erosion of the taxable base. In other countries, we found that governments often give it as part of their tax competition because they are competing for the same capital. And today that competition is going to be more intense than ever because of the capital discipline that oil companies are following because of the COVID crisis, because of the collapse in prices. So most likely we might see some governments revisiting their fiscal terms in a way that offer better terms to in favor of investors. And then the final feature, of course, out of many, I highlighted only the key features, is that it is typically also offered by governments in weak bargaining position. So Victoria earlier said that in some countries which are very rich in resources and maybe easily accessible resources, you don't find these kind of provisions. But in countries where you have, for example, the high geological risk or the overall sentiment in terms of investing in the country is not that great. So governments feel that they are in a weaker bargaining position, and therefore to improve their negotiation stance, they offer the fiscal stabilization clauses in the contract to appeal better to investors. However, one of our main conclusions after surveying all these countries and doing further analysis, we felt that there was probably, and this may be perhaps more from the private sector's perspective, is that there could be too much faith placed in structural stabilization, because we looked at countries where this is offered and we felt that its effectiveness is questionable, especially in countries which lack the administrative capability to enforce these kind of provisions, and also where you have a lack of credibility in countries where government policy, investments law, and judiciary are also weak. So it becomes even more complex to enforce. And also we thought that really, if you want to manage the risk, fiscal stabilization are quite incomplete in that respect, because for the main reasons I said earlier, it's simply not a perfect tool. Actually, it's far from being a perfect tool to predict all states of nature in the future and account for them in the contract. However, what we found, what could be and is actually a more effective and better way, and here I can say a more fair way or fairer way to safeguard benefits, is actually to use the fiscal regime itself. If you have a well-designed fiscal regime, which is largely progressive, which means, automatically it will adjust to changes in conditions, whether, for example, you will move from a small discovery to a big discovery, a high oil price environment, a low oil price environment, this would be captured automatically in a largely progressive fiscal regime, which is robustly designed, and where you have also the administrative capacity in the country to properly implement and administer that fiscal regime. Here you will have a more powerful tool to ensure stability of the system of the contract than I would say the fiscal stabilization provision, and you get over this issue of fairness or whether it's right or wrong in that come with fiscal stabilization clauses. That said, it was interesting to see that in some countries where fiscal stabilization clauses are still offered, some governments actually say, fine, we're talking about risk-reward balance for investors. So if we're going to give you this provision that lock in the fiscal terms for the duration of the contract, then your risk is going to be lower. And as such, you would accept a lower reward. And as a result, they say, okay, we can offer you this fiscal stabilization provision, but in return, you will pay a higher, for example, royalty rate or a higher corporate income tax rate. However, I'm not going to advocate any particular a formula for fiscal stabilization, because they do come in all sorts of shapes and colors. Really, we find a big variety. Small words in the formulation of the fiscal stabilization clause can make a huge difference between one contract and the other. They require definitely a very deep thinking before being given. And then on my last slide for you today, I want to refer you, because I talked about the fiscal regime. Here, I want to refer you to some principles published by the OECD, and I'm proud to say that I was involved in this in the formulation of these principles. And it was a very lengthy process, bringing different stakeholders together, just to show you it's not something that will make everybody happy. But the principles highlight maybe around 13 principles that, if followed, properly, could lead you to a more durable oil and gas contract without necessarily the use of fiscal stabilization provisions. So I strongly refer you to these provisions, to these principles, should you be interested. And on this note, I'm going to stop, and then we can take some questions later on during the Q&A. Thank you very much for listening. Victoria, I hand over to you.
All right, thank you, Carole. Could you please stop sharing? Okay. So we shall hear from Professor Cameron before we go for Q&A.
Well, thank you, Victoria. So I'm standing between the excellent presentations and the Q&A. So obviously I'll have to be brief. I've only got a few points that I want to make, and I'm not going to have any slides to share with you. So I hope you can follow what I'm saying. I've learned a lot from the preceding presentations, but I think these comments add to what we've just been hearing. Stabilization is a risk allocation device that focuses primarily on political risk. I think that there's something that's rather important to keep in mind, is that stabilization clauses are out there in thousands of contracts. They're there or in those contracts already. So you can't really start the debate with the question, should we have them or not? They're there. And governments have agreed to those clauses. They're all they're very different. Some of them are hybrids, but a key point is that they're there. You could, however, then start the discussion, well, do we want them in the future? Governments are quite free, of course, not to include them and not to offer them. But why they're there is basically as one incentive to an investor to come forward and commit capital, which is scarce. It's not just somehow out there waiting to come to invest in your latest project. So you're competing with other governments out there to get a share of that scarce capital. And now, at the moment, you're actually going to companies who have probably never in their entire lives confronted a situation in which oil and gas has been so unfashionable, and which so many investors in markets have been critical of the rates of return, critical of the efficiency, critical of fossil fuels themselves, and so on. So it's not a particularly easy matter to try and get them to commit that capital. And what I think you have to keep in mind is that this issue about stabilization tends to arise when there has been a discovery, and that's when often discussions arise about a possible renegotiation of the terms. But if we go back to why it's there, it's as I think Carole was pointing out, if I recall correctly, you do find that in the oil and gas industry there is this factor of risk about discovery, exploration risk, which you're not going to find if you're operating an energy utility. It's a completely different type of business. And so these companies are going into the investment and they're thinking, well, we can fail. And they have to build in failure to their model. So when they're actually going in to make their investment, they're thinking, well, we could have dry holes. We could have a complete failure. We might just fail and then leave. But if we succeed, we've got to get enough money to somehow iron out all of these costs that we've incurred with the failures. And that's very much something that's going to be in their minds when they come in. If they do succeed, they want to make a very substantial return. and not something that's average by any means. And what the government is doing, like in Mozambique, for example, goes to an international oil company and says, I want to develop the gas resources. You're asking for a huge investment of capital, long-term, complex, a lot of skills required to get that gas developed. That tends to be why the investor is going to say, we would like a form of stabilization. And they can maybe argue about the form, you can argue about the form, but they're going to need something like that, or they might have difficulty in going ahead. And a lot of governments, just made a calculation. This is what we have to give in order to get the investment, and they go ahead on that basis. So I think that explains what we've seen so far in the past, and why there are so many examples of stabilization clauses in oil and gas agreements. I would say, just adding to what's already been said, do not look at them in isolation. Look at the clauses in relation to, for example, choice of law clauses, arbitration. Is there arbitration? What kind of arbitration have you got in that contract? It's not enough just to look at the stabilization clause itself. And I'll come back to that point in a moment. Why are they there? Why would investors be looking for them? Why are they looking for them in, say, some developing countries in particular? Well, the answer is that in the past, if you look at the history, there have been instances when the entire legal regime post-discovery has been completely revised. And I mean, an example of that, Victoria, would be Uganda. Another example down the road, Tanzania. Once the discovery has been made, the system on which the calculations of the investor have been made changes. Now, that may be something they can live with, but it's something that they're keen to somehow manage in advance. That happens a lot. It's happened a lot in Latin America. So many of these investors, with that experience in mind, go in and say, we want some kind of security, that you won't simply rip up the regime that we've come in to invest on as a basis. For example, Nigeria, the deep water acreage that it wanted to allocate way back in the 1990s, about 1993, 94. They introduced in their PCs stabilization clauses, and they knew quite well, they were smart, that the only way that companies, not many companies can do this, at that time, to have the technology to go ahead and explore for petroleum in that deep water in offshore the Niger Delta, you really were talking about a handful of candidates, and they needed some kind of stabilization, and they got it. So, and the result was enormous, the enormous amount of success for Nigeria and for the investors. So it can work out quite well. Are these relevant for the future? And a couple of other points I want to make as well, but I think a problem is that the pressures on states, I mean, we're hearing about fairness. It's not just fairness, it's the pressures on states now tend to be maybe greater than they've ever been. If a state that has discovered hydrocarbons doesn't have a sound local content policy, then it's not doing its job. So you must have a very sound, systematic, workable local content approach. And many of the people in the public will expect that there should be an extensive amount of benefit coming to them. So if it doesn't come, they'll be unhappy about the government. So you have pressures that may be partly because also with the internet, information flows, that are more intense on governments than ever before. So the risk that governments might then decide that a regime that was suitable a few years ago before the discoveries is now no longer suitable. That risk, I think, is probably greater now than it's ever been. So two last points I want to make. Firstly, about stabilization. You can actually have, I was mentioning that you have to look at the contract clauses in relation to others. You can have several kinds of stabilization in the single contract. That can cause confusion, but it's not really unusual. And you may not get that in your model, but you may get it in the actual contract. It may be something that's been negotiated, because remember, these are maybe one of the most negotiated types of contracts that you're ever going to get. Long, sometimes maybe 2 years of negotiations. And another point to make is that the seat of arbitration, this may be a little bit complex for some people to get, but you could actually, if you find that the seat of arbitration is in the host country, then what can happen is that with a successful award, the stabilization clause might end up being set aside. I'm conscious of time here, so I'll just wrap up now. The transition, the energy transition, very important. How can you design a stabilization clause now going forward, thinking that your arrangement will stay in place for the next 20 years or 25 years? Maybe it's possible, but I think maybe there's also a challenge for people in thinking ahead, given that there's so many people who are saying that the age of fossil fuels is over. Maybe there'll be a decline in the use of oil and gas in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. So how can you expect that deal to remain stable throughout that time? I don't have an answer to that one, but I think that's something that people on both sides are going to have to keep in mind as they go forward and design stabilization clauses in the future, if they're going to have them. Because I think Victoria was suggesting that somehow they would not be quite so common in the future, which is a view. We'll have to see what happens there. Okay, Victoria, we've got lots of differences of opinion here in our panel, and that's healthy. We like diversity. I finished.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Now we shall go on the Q&A. Carole, there's this question about the economic equilibrium clauses, and the person is asking what principles should a host government consider when negotiating a threshold in economic stabilization provision in the petroleum contract. That is Mohammed Ahmed, but I think he's referring to the economic equilibrium. And also, I think we can also address the issue of whether economic equilibrium clauses are only targeting developing countries. So as Carole is answering that, Professor Cameron, you can respond to this question, the first one that was asked. Is there a formula or any best practices that a state can follow to ensure it preserves its sovereign prerogatives while at the same time honoring its contractual obligation as per the stabilization clauses? And could adaptation clauses be a worthy alternative to stabilization clauses? So Dr. Carole Nakhle will respond first, and then Professor Cameron. And I also see a question for me here, which I'll address.
Thank you, Victoria. Actually, I'm glad that we have expressed different views with respect to stabilization clauses or provisions in oil and gas contracts, because this is exactly a reflection of the reality as I mentioned in my presentation, ask 5 people at the same ministry in the same country, and you will get 5 different opinions with respect to the stabilization provision, including not just whether we should have it or we should not, but also in terms of the form and type. And Victoria, in your presentation, you had one slide showing the different types of stabilization provisions, at least when it's referred to fiscal stabilization. I would say there are one of them could be, you know, complete freezing, where you freeze all the terms in the contract for the whole duration of the contract. You specify that whatever happens outside this contract, then none of the terms as stated in the contract would be changed. This is really to simplify the terms. But there is, and this seems to be more, maybe it was quite fashionable in the early days of stabilization provisions, but we see them that over time, they kind of they have fallen out of fashion in favor of other types of provision that are the economic equilibrium, where without specifying, for example, that royalty should remain at 10% or whatever the corporate income tax at this percent, you say that overall the economic outcome for the contract should be kind of maintained. So irrespective of whether these taxes increase or decrease, overall, that's what we call it, economic equilibrium clauses. And again, here, even though the principle is the same, you see, I'm not a lawyer, but I work closely with lawyers, and I've seen different types of economic equilibrium provisions, but they are drafted very differently. And sometimes within the same country, they vary tremendously by country. And 1 or 2 words can lead to an entirely different outcome. I will not recommend, for example, a specific threshold, because I fully agree with Professor Peter Cameron when he said that you should not see it in isolation. In my opinion, you look at the contract, even when we are, for example, advising on the fiscal regime, we go through a whole process of reading the entire legislation, relevant legislation in the country, and even so sometimes things which are not directly related to oil and gas. We look at the nitty-gritty details in every single provision. It's like you are preparing a dish or a fruit cocktail. It's never about one ingredient. You have to take consideration how everything else is incorporated. And as I said earlier, I mean, if I were to choose between economic equilibrium provisions and a robustly designed progressive fiscal regime, then guess what? I will go for the latter, because the latter tends to be much more stable and durable than even the fiscal stabilization. So just to wrap up what I said, and I repeat what I mentioned earlier, it's not about whether you like or dislike fiscal stabilization provisions or stabilization in general in a contract. It's a question of how much faith you would put into those in terms of believing that they would protect you against any kind of adverse government reaction or change in legislation. And this is where we found that we should be careful and giving stabilization provisions too much importance, but at the same time, governments should also be careful in the drafting of these provisions so that they know what they are committing to. Because at the end, and allow me here to mention that, Victoria, because I saw it, I think, in one of the questions, one word which keeps on coming whenever we discuss these issues, that is sovereignty of governments. At the end, the sovereign is free to do whatever they want, but you don't want to make adverse sudden changes. You may win in the short term, you may get away with what you want. And Victoria, you excellently mentioned Venezuela with late President Chavez. He got away with sudden changes of the terms, but look at where Venezuela is today. So you have to not only to think about the immediate impact of your decision with respect to stabilization provisions, whether you respect them or not, but also the longer term impact, because investors may be slow to react, but they will react at some point.
Thank you, Carole. Professor Cameron, would you like to address your question?
Yes, thank you, Victoria. So the question is about whether there are any best practices that a state can follow to ensure that it preserves its sovereign prerogatives, but at the same time honors its contractual obligation, particularly with respect to a stabilization clause. Second part is whether an adaptation clause would be a worthy alternative. I don't see it as an alternative. I see adaptation as a form of stabilization clause. I know some people have a different view about that. it's not one I share. I think it's a form of stabilization. What it effectively does is say that if there is a change in law, and then defines what the change of law is with a certain effect, and again, the effect is something that has to be proved, then the parties will, and then there's a process set out, meet to discuss with a view to reaching a defined outcome. And that is one way of writing a stabilization clause, which doesn't prevent the state from changing its law. It recognizes that the state has sovereignty to do so in the future, even after it's agreed to a stabilization clause. But it tries to rectify the situation so that the investor who has made a bargain with the state, wearing a kind of commercial hat when it's agreed to this, that the outcome is one that is fair, in the sense that it reflects the bargain that they made at the beginning. So that's something that works, I think, quite well. Victoria also mentioned the allocation of burden type of stabilization, which is slightly different. It just means that effectively the state company will take responsibility for the tax, for any increase in tax, and it will pay it, so that the government can increase the tax, it can change the law, it can impose duties on the investor, but in a commercial way, there'll be an allocation within the contract so that tax then gets paid by the NOC. That respects the original bargain. Again, neither of those types of contract prevent the state from introducing changes if it wishes to do so. So I think there are ways of doing this, but there are many hybrid forms. Egypt and Ghana both introduce, both have a way of taking the contract to the parliament and getting the seal of approval, so that every contract, which I know in the case of Ghana and Egypt includes stabilization clauses, those contracts are approved by parliament. So you get a legislative approval, and in a way the contract becomes a law. It becomes a what they call a sui generis type of law, and that's not unusual. It's happened for many years in the international oil and gas industry. But it's one way of legitimizing the contract and the terms that it contains. I think probably that's everything on that point, Victoria. So I don't see it as something to worry about. And also, you really got to get very careful. I know some people have different views on this, particularly since I live in Britain, and many people have different views on this subject, that sovereignty is the most precious thing in the world. To me, being a pragmatic Scotsman, I'd like to see the money, frankly. Is there going to be a development of this resource if we want to develop it? And if so, what's happening to all that revenue? These are the sort of questions that excite me rather than the sovereignty ones. But I do accept other people have a kind of emotional attachment to the sense of the resource being the national patrimony and so on.
Victoria, if I may add just one more point, which I should have mentioned earlier, but I definitely agree on the issue of sovereignty, but in the developing world, but in particular, I would say it's quite a crucial issue. If you think of Latin America, for instance, but even other parts of the world, I mean, thinking about Iraq, for instance, how heated the debate was a few years ago between the KRG and the government of Baghdad. But you see, just staying with a discussion about stabilization provision, sometimes even if they are not offered, there are certain types of fiscal instruments, for instance, that can perhaps act as powerfully as fiscal stabilization clauses. And here I'm thinking about things such as taxes paid on behalf, whether it is a corporate income tax or whether the royalty or whatever, it can be any tax, so that, you know, you embed it. For those who are not familiar with this issue, let me try to simplify it. So you say, instead of paying the corporate income tax separately, what some governments do, they say, okay, we're going to incorporate that kind of tax payment as part of the government share, let's say in the production sharing agreement. That can have a more powerful, even, you know, if not, you know, I don't want to say equal, but it's quite powerful a stabilization of the fiscal terms in the contract. So it doesn't necessarily need to say stabilization provision of the contract.
Thank you, Carole. I think I would just add on that also to respond to my question. So with the issue of sovereignty, in my opinion, I feel in the 21st century, especially for countries that are stable, for countries that haven't experienced any political instability, for countries that haven't been, let's say, that haven't nationalized oil and gas investments before, in the 21st century, some of these countries, like Namibia, should be able to negotiate these stabilization clauses in a way that benefits them. Because if you had to compare, let's say, Namibia and some of these developed countries like Norway, it's the same situation. So for me, the question would be for the investor, what exactly are you worried about? What are these risks are you concerned about? Can these risks be tackled through various provisions like the arbitration clauses, the national investment laws? So if there are other provisions and national laws that can offer the same protection, then I think the issue of stabilization clauses in the 21st century should be renegotiated. And the clauses themselves, it shouldn't be for a very long period of time, let's say 30 years. What countries can do is negotiate for a specific period of time so that they still have the powers to respond to the social, economic, political, and also various changes in their countries. So this will be my concluding remarks. But before we close, I would like Professor Cameron and Dr. Carole Nakhle to respond to the many questions we're getting with respect to energy transitions, their impact on stabilization clauses. So Carole, you can respond on the issue of fiscal stabilization clauses. Are they likely to be impacted by these energy transition moves and the initiatives to tackle climate change? And also Professor Cameron, you can respond to the legal stabilization clauses. And then we shall end our webinar on time.
Who would you like to go first?
Ladies first.
Okay, sorry, Peter. Right, you know, perhaps before I answer that question, I have to say that I see personally no replacement for government credibility, a strong institutional framework, transparent system, good governance. So I don't see, even, you know, if you go down the route of stabilization clause, that they would replace what is for me a more important pillar, that is a credible institutional framework and government policy in a country. So that is one point I wanted to clarify. The issue of energy transition, well, there are different ways one can look at this question. Some investors, yes, you can understand that they would be concerned about what could happen in the next 20, 30 years. If they are going to commit their capital today, especially it's increasingly scarce capital, and they'll be very cautious in terms of where to allocate. They don't want then after 10 years to be told, oops, we don't need your investment anymore, or we don't need your oil and gas anymore. So if you look at it from this perspective, there could be a bigger push from the investors' side for stabilizing the contract terms for the duration of the contract, maybe, and maybe look for economic equilibrium provisions, for example, in the contract. So that could act more of a boost for stabilization provisions. The way I would see it is also that how the energy transition will translate in prices for oil and gas prices. And if you look at the energy transition, then if it's going to translate in a shrinking market for oil and gas, and also it was going to put downward pressure on prices. So again, here you may want, so it depends on what you negotiate, but again, that could also provide an incentive for signing, or negotiating attractive terms today, and and actually it could be a fertile ground today to negotiate attractive terms from the investor's side, of course, without putting the government at a disadvantage, and again, looking the terms of the contract for the longest duration possible for investors. So on balance, if I only look at this, and again, it is much more complex than just giving these two issues, but that's what comes to my mind straight away. I would say we might see a more investors calling for stabilization provisions, but it depends on where you are. So it's not going to be like a blanket solution or the same attitude everywhere. In my presentation, I highlighted where you have the highest chance of finding these stabilization provisions. So I might find there, or if you have a history of government policy or fiscal changes that change in ad hoc way, then you will find this kind of stabilization provisions. But bear in mind that negotiating very attractive fiscal terms from the investor's perspective, at least that's what experience and history tells us, with or without stabilization provisions, are unlikely to be stable for too long.
Thank you very much, Carole. Professor Cameron.
Okay, well, let me just make two final points. One is a question that has come up from Peter Stewart. I see he's talking about the impact of a stabilization clause, and maybe that's something that we should have mentioned earlier. That basically arbitral tribunals have always upheld stabilization clauses in oil and gas contracts. And in the book of mine, which Victoria has a copy of, there's a chapter that deals with a whole list of decisions in which tribunals have upheld stabilization clauses. And I think that's something that can't be underemphasized. That is partly why for the investor it's an important thing to have, because even if the government overrides the stabilization clause, the chances are you're going to get more in terms of damages than you would if you did not have the stabilization clause. It can also act as a deterrent as well, requiring governments to take maybe different strategies if they want some form of renegotiation to take place. The transition, as far as existing contracts are concerned, keep in mind, if that stabilization clause is there, we don't yet know what governments are going to do to respond to the energy transition in countries that are producing oil and gas. At the moment, probably not very much, but that will certainly change. And you get an idea of what might happen if you look at some of the countries that are not so concerned with oil and gas production in the northern hemisphere, where some countries, say Canada, East Canada, have tried to phase out coal, for example, and there've already been arbitrations about these measures on the basis of treaties. And that's something that is going to happen. You're going to get a lot of disputes in this area. We haven't really seen them on oil and gas yet, but they will come. And possibly in those disputes, stabilization clauses will have a role to play. Think about decommissioning, for example. Well, you might find the decommissioning starts in some countries a lot earlier than we thought it was going to start because of the impact of the transition. We just don't know at the moment, but there's a lot of existing law that could be relied on, existing contractual clauses that could be relied on to address some of these government measures. And I think probably that sounds a bit confrontational, but trying to remember, it's all a partnership. The investors and the governments are in this together. They're not in it to have a fight with each other. They're just trying to have stable relationships over a very, very long period of time in the face of all these uncertainties that Carole has so ably pointed out. that make this world look at the moment extremely uncertain. And thank goodness many of us here are not in the investment business, because it would certainly give us all sleepless nights, I think. Victoria, I'm going to finish on that note. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Cameron. And then also, I think I'll make my last remarks with respect to energy transition. Yes, we've seen lots of initiatives. Yes, we've seen investors getting worried about the energy transition, but we also know that in the global south, for the countries that have the resources, they are investing. I'll give the example of my own country, Uganda. They're still excited about the petroleum resources. They're investing a lot, and we're seeing investors also not giving up on these investments. And also the recent report that came out from Oxford, I think last week, showing that the petroleum sector or oil and gas will still play a major role in developing countries. So the energy transition is there, but it doesn't mean that investments in oil and gas will end at the same time. It might be progressive, it might have an impact, but at the same time, with the role of oil and gas in the global south, it means that more investments will be made, because investors go where there are opportunities. And I think once they see that there are opportunities in these countries, they'll always go. But in the meantime, obviously, they'll be concerned about their investments. They'll be concerned about the stability, the protection, and all the things that are likely to impact them. So this will definitely need to be taken into consideration for host governments when they're negotiating stabilization clauses, but also most importantly, ensuring that they have an effective legal and regulatory framework so that investors are comfortable that their investments will be protected. In instances where there are stabilization clauses, but even where the stabilization clauses are not there, they can always refer to other ways of protecting their investments, like I mentioned, through arbitration clauses, national laws, multilateral investment treaties, bilateral investment treaties. All those are avenues to protect investment. In closing, do not forget to get these books, of course. This is by Professor Peter Cameron, International Energy Law, The Pursuit of Stability. So everything we've been discussing, you'll find it in this book in detail.
And my book as well.
I have to advertise your book, Carole.
No, I know, I'm just teasing you. Thank you.
And then this is Carole's book, Petroleum Taxation. She has written a lot on the fiscal regime, including economic equilibrium clauses and many other information. So as you can see, you've had panelists who have written, and then for people who had questions with respect to energy transitions in Africa, this is my edited book. And I also have another book on energy access, which really illustrates the issue of energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and why countries should utilize all the resources, oil, gas, renewables, to tackle the challenge of energy poverty. So this marks the end of our webinar. Get yourself that book. And obviously we shall share the slides. I'm sure I have all your email addresses. So I will share with you the slides, and do not forget to register for our other webinars. Thank you very much, Professor Cameron. Thank you very much, Carole. And thank you very much, our viewers. This marks the end of our webinar. It's live on YouTube, so you can share the link with all your contacts. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks, Victoria.